Hello, welcome to this episode of the Superhero Ethics Podcast. Today we're talking about a Batman animated story that appeared on HBO, an animated movie based on a lot of people's favorite comic run of Batman, The Long Halloween. This story you can see origins of the Dark Knight in, you can see origins of The Batman with Robert Pattinson, and Paul Hoppe and I are going to be diving into it right after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. This is Matthew, your host, they, them pronouns. And Paul, this is a story that I know you have wanted to talk about for a while. Batman, The Long Halloween. And just to give a quick explanation for folks, this is an animated movie you can find on, I think it's on HBO Plus primarily. There may be other ways to get DC movies. DC Animation has been putting out a ton of animated movies, primarily about Batman, some about Superman, some about more the Justice League in general, that aren't really talked about much, but that Paul has really turned me on to. We've been having a lot of fun going through them, and we're going to really have a lot to talk about because it raises some of the fundamental questions of Batman and the Batman stories. And we'll tell you more about what the story is in a second. But first, Paul, let me just have as an intro. Tell me more about why it was that you loved the story and why you wanted it to be one we talked about.
Yeah, so I don't really follow what's coming out when and stuff like that. But when Lee and I were at her mom's last year, kind of in the middle of moving, we technically didn't really live anywhere for about a month, and we were on our way to Vegas. We were, browsing HBO Max and we're like, oh, there's this is out. Maybe she actually knew it was out because she reads things in the news and whatever. But
right.
But so we just put it on and watched it, and it was like, oh, this is really good. And then it was like, wait, that was part one. and then there's a part two, and we watched the part two, which conveniently actually came out the same day, which seems like it's interesting that they broke it into two parts, and I guess we could talk about that a little later. But basically, it's kind of like a 3-hour animated movie that covers the span of a year, from Halloween to Halloween. And I just think it's the type of Batman story that is my favorite type of Batman story, and is fairly different from a large amount of, other superhero fiction that we see on screen. And then just the animation, I think, is fantastic. And in terms of story, I think DC's animation is overall, on average, the best stuff they put out on screen, compared to, say, television, non-animated, and then live action films.
And I think a large part of that is because the bar is so much lower in a weird way, and that they're not having to have this constant, first of all, the budget is much lower, so they don't need to justify the huge budget. They don't need to have a huge mass market appeal. And I think in some ways these movies are really helped by mostly flying under the radar screen, because they're not therefore in the, well, how does this compare to the other version of Batman? How does this compare to the Marvel movie that's coming out at the same time? How does this tie in all these things? It just gets to be a story on its own in a really great way.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this is what you're saying, but in terms of the bar being lower, I think you mostly mean financially, right? In terms of how much money something grosses. And I mean, I guess in terms of
as I said, the bar is low. I was not quite what I meant. I mean, it's more that the outside expectations that don't really have much to do with the movie itself are mostly not there.
Right. And certainly the, broader population doesn't have expectations for what, the thing's going to look like. I do think that there are a lot of people who are really into animation, DC, and, specifically animated DC that, occasionally something comes along and is highly anticipated and is very disappointing to most people, say The Killing Joke, which I recently watched a thing about it, and I was like, I feel like they're saying things about the animation. I'm like, I think the animation was fantastic. The story, there's, you can have your issues with the story, sure, and in terms of how it was adapted precisely. But yeah, I mean, I think the expectations are amongst a smaller group of people, I would say.
Right.
And you just don't have the same amplitude of, the types of reviews that you're going to get and the types of responses. So I think generally that's like healthier for anything someone's creating, right? Where it's just like, yeah, you get to do your thing. You get to say, this is what we want to do. You do it the best you can, and then people will take it as they do, as opposed to, having huge expectations. It's like a team that wins a championship, and then the next year, if they're like the runner up, then that's a disappointment somehow. It's like, I feel like that's how feature films or like blockbusters are often treated. It's like, oh, well, is this a disappointment compared to such and such? It's like, why is that even the conversation? It's just like, can't the thing just like live on its own? Like, is this good? Is it not good? Do you like it? Do you not like it? And so I that's my very long-winded way of saying, yes, I agree that I feel like this animation manages to not be a victim of expectations.
And I think one part of that may be that this is a lot more kind of day in the life aspect. And this is like we talked about on the last podcast a little bit in terms of Dread. Well, I'm not sure what order this would come out in, but it's one thing we talked about Dread. But not even day in the life, but like
year in the life.
A year in the life, but also this is not part of a very fixed continuity. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways that really helps it because like I love the MCU. I do like continuity, but I think part of what has gotten away from is, and I think in some ways, like the age of the internet makes this harder, but like there used to be a lot of stories where it was, okay, we know who these characters are, and because we're going to tell you a story that isn't about a fundamentally changed moment in this character's life, it's just kind of about like the character doing the thing the character does, and a lot of other characters doing the things that those characters do. It's okay that we don't know exactly where this fits in time compared to this other version of the story, or if it a little bit contradicts that version of the story. It's just kind of a standalone story using characters that we know well. Mm-hmm. I think that's very hard to do in the MCU, or like, in DC. Now we have to have long conversations about like, well, the Robert Pattinson Batman doesn't exist in the same universe as like the Snyderverse or like this other thing. And we have to be very specific about it. Because the animation has never been trying to be part of one whole unified universe, like, yes, this movie does tell the Harvey Dent origin story, and it does tell the death of Falcone, but it also doesn't, it doesn't make pretensions to sort of be like a definitive story that everything else has to reference. And I think that really helps it just be its own thing.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that there are like runs of comics, right? Which will have continuity with each other. And then often they'll have some giant multiverse thing that's like, okay, sure, whatever. That like theoretically connects all of them. Like I think DC has like 52 universes exactly. Yep. But you'll get, and with the animated movies, you got a series of them that, there was this one run of them that I didn't love them, but they were kind of all in the same style and they kind of all had a continuity. And then there's like the Flashpoint story, and then, then it kind of reverts, and then they just start making a new continuity, right? And so you do get these kind of series, but I don't think there's ever this sense of this is the definitive version of these characters, right? It's like this series of interpretations. And, this story, as you mentioned, The Dark Knight borrowed from it. The Batman borrows from it, right? Quite heavily. I think I somewhat jokingly referred to the Batman movie as the short Halloween, because
yes, I remember that.
Right, it has so much from this, but it's a week instead of a year. Which for a live action feature film, I think a week or a day or 2 or 3 days, I find usually the perfect length of time. I think really extended movies don't work that well. The reason this works well to me is that the principal plot revolves around Holiday, this like person who murders people on holidays, and each scene or each sequence, basically the movies are broken up into segments that are each kind of like one day, right? And it'll be just a series of holidays. So it's basically like 12 days played across 3 hours. So you essentially maybe get 12, 15-minute segments, more or less. A couple of them are shorter.
Right.
But yeah, I think the fact that there isn't this weight of continuity on this really lets it breathe more and lets them... One of the things I really enjoyed here is that they have so many members of the Rogues Gallery in it, right? Mm-hmm. And they're able to be bit players, and you can kind of do whatever you want with them, and it doesn't feel like, oh, but that's not that character. It's like, no, that's this version of that character. And if I didn't like any of the versions of them, like, it wouldn't have felt like such a big deal. I didn't really dislike any of the versions of them particularly. You know, there's a few things about, like, well, why is Ivy, like, always working for someone else? She's, like, the most powerful of all these people and whatever, you know? Like, so she doesn't have the depth that I'd like to see in her character, but, like, that's okay because this isn't, like, the Poison Ivy. It's, like, it's just Poison Ivy in this one thing, and she's a small part of it. And, like, that's fine. And there's a lot of characters, like the Joker, you know? Similarly, is this kind of minor character in this story that just... It makes it feel like it's Gotham. It makes it feel like there's this depth and there's this breadth, without feeling like it's trying to be the defining version of anything. And I just find that really pleasant.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And it kind of addresses something that you and I have always talked about, which is that the part of the problem with these larger interconnected universes is that it doesn't make sense that a whole bunch of people never show up. Mm-hmm. And yet, you know, if you have a story where it would make sense for Captain America to show up for 5 minutes, but you don't have the budget for Christopher Evans to do, you know, 4 days of shooting to get those 5 minutes, it's hard to make it happen. But here you can do that. And we'll fill in the details of what the actual story is in a second, but it's, as Paul said, there's the stuff that's happening. And so, at various points in time, different characters make appearances, and in many cases, it makes sense why they're showing up for various reasons or another. As you said, some less, some it's just because someone involved has hired them, and it's like, oh, okay, that's fine. But like the Joker was one of my favorites because the Joker, like the minute the Joker shows up, a part of me thinks, oh, okay, so this is actually a Joker plot on some level, and it's like, no, the Joker's just mad that this other villain is getting so much of the headlines and attention. So the Joker's like, no, I gotta try and fix this. I gotta try to make it all about me.
Right, exactly.
And literally winds up just like gas attacking a thing that half the city is going to be at because, as the Joker says, like, yeah, there's a 50% chance that one of the random people I kill will be this guy. Right. And then that way I'm not losing the attention.
Exactly.
And it fits so perfectly for the Joker. And it gives Batman a chance to deal with the Joker, but it isn't a Joker story, and Joker doesn't take over the story.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, and it just does that with a whole lot of characters, right?
Yeah. Do you want to try giving a brief summary of the story, and so that we can like kind of fill things in as we go, or do you want me to try to do that?
Yeah, I'll give a brief summary. First of all, just in terms of the feel of the story, I want to say that like it's a story where Batman does Batman things, but it doesn't really feel like it's a story about Batman doing Batman things, you know, like big, you know, gadgety, like huge fight scenes and stuff. Like that's in there, but that's not the focus. It's a mystery detective story. And it's also less of a story about Batman being a great detective and more about Batman becoming a great detective. And the basic premise is Carmine Falcone is like the big mob boss in the city. And then there's also Maroni, right, who's like his main competition. And someone kills Falcone's nephew on Halloween, who actually was about to testify against Falcone, right, against Carmine. And so the whole thing has this, you know, Harvey Dent, James Gordon, Batman, you know, trio of characters doing that whole Dark Knight, trying to bring down the Gotham mob, right? Which is like this very traditional mafia situation. And throughout the year, on every holiday or on one holiday per month, basically, somebody comes and kills someone, usually part of Falcone's crime family, right? Or family, actually, not even they kill someone who's not really part of the crime family, who he doesn't want to be part of the crime family. So it feels like it's this, you know, something against Falcone, right? Meanwhile, there are all of these, costumed villains locked up in Arkham, and at various points, various ones of them get free, right? And actually, I would say that this is the story of, if you look at kind of the overarching thing, this is the story of how Gotham goes from being, basically like a mobbed up town to a costumed villain town.
Yeah. And there's a clear distinction between the two in a way that's really interesting, especially in the perspective of, in some ways, the traditional kind of like, you find him in any, Godfather, Goodfellas movie, criminals are a lot worse or a lot scarier in some ways. Right,
exactly. And I think also, like, you could kind of look at it in the like D&D alignment sort of fashion, where it's like, you've got Harvey Dent and James Gordon who are trying to be lawful good, right? And then you have organized crime, which is lawful evil. And then you have, the Joker and people like the Joker, which is like chaotic evil. And then you have Batman, who's like chaotic good. But everybody's kind of trying to work with someone else to further their own ends. And,
and Catwoman, who's chaotic. Catwoman, who's like somewhere chaotic neutral to chaotic good.
Exactly. And like, in this, she's more of, she's more basically just like an anti-hero like Batman,
Right.
There are a lot of similarities between this Catwoman and the Batman Catwoman. And, at the end of it, not to give away necessarily the final story, because I feel like we could kind of cover this without saying, what the actual answer to the mystery is. But it's basically, there's a serial killer, and it's about Batman and others trying to figure out who that is while all this other stuff goes on at the same time.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important. I do want to say who it is, because I think there's some really interesting ethical questions around that gets into some of the things. But we can have kind of like, that'll be on a spoiler section later.
Okay, that sounds good.
For sure. Because, I think you're right. I want to talk about just some of the different parts of it that I most enjoyed and the questions it kind of raises. And it's funny we're talking about this. This will probably come out a couple weeks after our episode on Dredd. We have recorded it very recently after recording the episode on Dredd, the movie about, I keep wanting to say Judge Dredd, but that's the Stallone version. This is the urban version. But the movie deals with a lot of the same issues that does, and it's questions that are very central to what I love about Batman in general, which is all these questions around, like, okay, when you've got a broken justice system and it's almost impossible to fight the criminal elements because of that broken justice system, and that gets into all sorts of sociological analysis, to be sure. But, like, what do you do? And I remember I said at one point as I was watching the movie, this is going to be The Dark Knight, because it is set at the beginning while Harvey Dent is still Harvey Dent, before anything has happened to him. And it's Harvey and Gordon fighting with each other about how to best take down these mobsters at a time when neither one of the two of them trusts each other. And Batman trying to get in the middle, and them having these interesting conversations about how do we deal with, like, to what extent can we break the law, or can we cross lines in order to take down these people for whom there are no lines and there are no laws. And that part of it's very much the Dark Knight story. And then as it continues, you see that it's kind of the Dark Knight story and the Batman Robert Pattinson story all kind of mixed up together. Or at least both of those are drawn from this.
Right, exactly. So it feels that way when you watch this after seeing those, but it's like, those just actually extracted these particular things from this story.
Right. And so I want to start there with what was your take on, because certainly I think for one thing, it shows the slow descent of Harvey Dent. I love The Dark Knight, don't get me wrong. I thought the actor who played him was fantastic. Aaron Eckstein, I think it is.
Eckhart.
But it shows it in a much slower way and a much more protracted, like you said, over the course of a year. What did you think of Dent and his kind of evolution of a story in this movie?
I feel like this Dent has a little bit more room to develop. It's interesting because in terms of runtime, this is actually longer than The Dark Knight, right? Which feels like a pretty long movie. I think The Dark Knight is like 2.5 hours.
I think that's right,
give or take, right? And this is 3 hours, but it's 2 1.5-hour animated films, or like 1:25, a minute 25, a minute 27, or an hour 25. Sorry. So it feels like there's more room for some of those things to breathe here. Also, The Dark Knight, I think Aaron Eckhart did a great performance of Harvey Dent and then Two-Face.
Eckhart, that's right. Yeah. Thank you.
But Heath Ledger was just sucking up all the oxygen in the movie,
That's true.
I'm not saying the Joker wasn't great in this, but the Joker doesn't dominate the story, as we've discussed. Yeah. And there are a lot of characters here. And so I'm not even sure Dent gets more screen time, but the fact that this is spread out over a year, it just, so you get to kind of see these snapshots of where Dent is at these different points in time, right? It kind of, I'm not going to go there. I was going to say something about The Last Jedi, not The Last Jedi. Jesus, what am I talking about? I was going to say something about Tales of the Jedi and how it developed a particular character over several instances. But if you had 12 instances there, maybe it would have felt different, right? And so here it's like you get these little snapshots of where Harvey is at different points in time. And for me, that really sells it, because it lets there be this transformation that isn't just, this one event happened and now all of a sudden he's Two-Face, right? Even though that was kind of in there, that was his nickname, whatever. But that one kind of goes from White Knight straight to Two-Face. And this feels like there's always this conflict in there. There's always some complexity to the character. We don't see all of it, right? It's not the Harvey Dent story, but that is a huge part of the story. And they get to kind of have a little bit more of a slow burn with it, both because of runtime and because of the fact that it's basically these this dozen snapshots throughout time.
Right. And I think one reason why it really works is that, as you said, it's not just the one moment. There's a lot having to do with his family, but more than anything, instead of it being about him losing someone, it's really about cynicism and pragmatism, and him starting out as this because one of the first kind of major conflicts is they come across a whole pile of, Falcone's money, and literally just stacks of cash.
Yeah.
And they're trying to decide what to do with it. And one of the things they realize is if they go by the books, if they follow the law and what they're supposed to do of turning it in, there's a very good chance that Falcone is going to intercept that at some point and get it back, because the whole system is so corrupt.
Right.
And Catwoman is kind of there and winds up suggesting what they wind up doing, which is burning it.
Yeah.
Which is very illegal. And you can tell that Dent is the one who winds up coming around to that position, but you can see that he's wrestling with it. And that from that, and then as you said, it's almost a year later that he gets, attacked and has his face burned away, this time with acid, and thus winds up becoming Two-Face. You just get to see his sort of gradual. To me, it's such a fundamental question that hits for all of us, because it's about lack of faith in a system. He starts out as the character who most thinks, no matter how much corruption there is, no matter how much goodness there, no matter how much badness there is, the law and the system of justice and the system of laws will work if we stick to it. And really the story is about his just losing all faith in that.
Yeah. And, at the beginning, Gordon's bend the rules, don't break them. But, and then they just break them right away. But there's this wrestling with that, right? And this he's a DA. His whole career is, I am going to use the law to, try and, mostly it's specifically this one guy he seems to really want to go hard against. But I think overall he's a true believer that is the way, or at least a way, if not the way, of trying to change things, right? And we're led to believe things have been quite bad, and that there's that this cynicism is shared by most of the population. And I think really it ends up kind of coming through that that maybe that's just not gonna work. And by the end of it, there's a question like, is any of it going to work? Is doing things not according to the system, does that work?
In that regard, it's almost a much less hopeful story than The Dark Knight is, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And here we're talking about in terms of how The Dark Knight is about the fall of Harvey Dent. Because by the end of The Dark Knight, you certainly get the perspective that there's this idea that a White Knight fought, the White Knight didn't work, but that actually what Batman does work and will help and will turn around the city, even if it has to be done in a way where no one understands what Batman's actually doing or that kind of thing. And then it gets really messy with the third movie. But there is, I think, to me, the end of the Dark Knight movie is much more hopeful, whereas this one is okay, well, Batman, Harvey Dent has been caught. It's been figured out who Holiday is, and that has its own ending. But I don't have any sense that Batman has turned things around in the city in any way.
Yeah, definitely not. Right at the end, Batman is there on the rooftop, where the bat signal is, with Gordon and Two-Face now. And he says something like, was it worth it? And Two-Face says he wants to know whether the good guys won, Jim. And Gordon's like, yes, the good guys won, but we won't know for a very long time if it was worth it. Which to me is saying, yes, we won this battle in terms of we achieved the goal of taking down Carbine Falcone, right? But we won't know for a long time whether or not that's going to make a positive difference for the city.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. That was the exact language that was occurring to me of the battle versus the war. And it's part of a trend that I think I'm really appreciating because, we had decades and decades of Batman is good, Batman is helping Gotham. And then you always had to wonder, so why is Gotham so bad after so many decades of Batman doing this? Mm-hmm. But that's the timeline of comics. But then I think you started to get a lot of criticism of Batman starting about 10 years ago or so. That was but Batman's not actually helping. All Batman is doing is punching poor people, which I think there's some legitimacy to those complaints. Why doesn't Batman spend his money to make the city better? I think he actually does in a lot of ways, and a lot of those stories don't. It's easy to sort of make that critique without realizing that that's not quite accurate, but that's a whole other story. But I appreciate that I think with some of the newer stories, and I think Pattinson's Batman definitely does this, and this Batman does it as well, instead of it being attacking him himself, it's much more of Batman is winning these individual battles, and he's saving people's lives by doing so, and he is stopping bad people by doing so. But is he winning the war? And I really appreciate that level, and I think in part that's part of the self-reflection that Pattinson is going through in the movie, and that by the end of that movie, he kind of is maybe by giving hope instead of by giving fear, I can, win the war in a different way. And this movie doesn't get to that place of hope by the end, but I guess it sort of does with the trick-or-treaters. But I think I really like that about this movie, is that it's giving a chance for him to win the battle, but for him himself to say, I don't know if this is winning the war. Yeah, and,
I think I have a lot to say about those particular criticisms, and I won't get too deep into it, but basically just I think it's always been, or for a long time, I think it's been more complicated than that. But I do think there's a thing in the very first scene is Falcone trying to get Bruce Wayne to sign on to doing something with him, some business thing, because Falcone and Thomas and Martha Wayne had done some things building some hospitals together or whatever that somehow, maybe lent some legitimacy to the Falcone name. Right. Uh-huh. But also built hospitals. Right. And Bruce just responds, I believe in Gotham City. And at the end, Falcone asks the same thing. He's like, do you still believe? And Batman's like, I do, and I guess somehow he knows that's him. Because he basically tells him it's him because of the thing about the coin or whatever. There's a line of dialogue that's shared, where he basically tells a dying Falcone that, he's Bruce Wayne, I think. And I think there's this idea that Batman does believe in Gotham and wants Gotham to be better, but that it's complicated, and that I think there is some logic to the idea, or some truth to the idea, that like you can't just ignore like violent crime, right? Yeah. Like you can't just have people going around murdering people and then not do anything to try and make that happen less, basically, right? But that also, one of the main reasons that there is as much violent crime as there is, or violence, I'm not even going to say crime, right? The reason there is as much violence as there is partially because of resources and a lack of resources and the desperation that comes from having a lack of resources. And so, you know, I think sometimes you get people saying, oh, we should only address this situation like in terms of like social programs. And then sometimes you get people saying, oh, we should only address this situation in terms of like, you know, really harsh policing. And I'm not arguing for the government doing both of those, like exactly, right? But what I'm saying is overall, like, I think you have to find ways to address both the urgent, immediate, right now, you know, somebody is suffering from violence, and the ever present pressing issue of resources are not being distributed adequately to everyone, basically.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think the way I've been kind of seeing it more and more, and I think you helped me understand that the Batman, the Pattinson movie, kind of actually has some of this in it, that I think if the view is we have this broken system, and as part of this broken system, people are getting hurt, people are getting killed, and bad people are doing bad things and getting away with them. And the phrase bad people there is very subjective, obviously. But that one thing that can be helpful is to have a person who is sometimes using violence as a way to protect people and to stop people from doing bad things. Maybe we should get rid of the whole idea of bad people in general, but just like stopping people from doing bad things and protecting people from bad things happening to them. And I think for too long, the thought was if you do that enough, and if you punch the people who are doing the bad things hard enough, they'll stop doing the bad things and everything will be better. And then the other side of the argument has been, well, but no, you're actually making things worse by punching the bad people and trying to save people. And I think the first point is clearly wrong. The second point, I think there's some truth to, but I think goes way too far. And at least where I'm coming down to it, and I think you're coming to a similar place, is like what Batman is doing is one necessary part of the equation. There also needs to be, like, what Batman is doing is saying we've got a bad system and people are being hurt and people are getting away with it. And I'm going to try and, within that system, try and make those two things change. And I'm reflecting the fact that that those things in the system are a big part, that those things in the system are a big part of what it makes it hard to change the system. So that I'm hoping that my, like, protecting more people and stopping more people from doing bad things and maybe giving some people some hope will create room for other people, and maybe I'll help or maybe I'll not, maybe it's Bruce Wayne who'll do this, to actually make the change happen. And it's kind of a V for Vendetta thing of like, V can do all the violence to stop things, but it's the people who then have to like actually make the change and do the positive thing. And I think what I'm coming down to is that kind of a place of like, I think Batman can't punch the system until it is better, but Batman can figure things out, do the detective work, do the fighting work, protect people, stop bad things from happening, and in so doing, making it possible for maybe him or maybe others to actually make the change, but that those have to be two kind of different things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, you know, and especially, you know, if Batman can stop people from causing harm to others without causing irrevocable harm to those people, right? That are attempting to inflict the harm, like, you know, and that's sort of the difference between like lethal and non-lethal. In comic books, you have non-lethal. In our world, you have less lethal, right? Less likely to be lethal. But like in terms of using that sort of violence as opposed to just killing everybody like the Punisher would.
Right.
And I think, V for Vendetta is a great example because, like, V's not going to just take the mask off and then be someone who's, like, trying to help solve the other side of the equation. Right. Whereas Batman can take the mask off and pretend he's just Bruce Wayne and then probably do a lot of good in theory, Yeah. And I mean, of course, it's not like you can necessarily just use a bunch of money to change everything. But, money does help. And I think influence helps more. And
I don't think this is a perfect example, and certainly it gets watered down over the many seasons in different directions it goes. But I think Oliver Queen is a good example of how that can work, where, at least in the CW show, and I think in some of the other versions as well, the Arrow or the Green Arrow is doing that kind of Batman work, but then his other persona, Oliver Queen, is using his money and using his political influence to try and change the system and make the systemic changes so that it's not all the bad things that are happening. And I think in the Pattinson movie, I think we're starting to get there, especially in the way that movie ends. And so, yeah, I would love to see more of that kind of thing. And which is, again, let me actually back up here a second. Because my point is, I'm not saying that those are therefore better than this. I'm saying what I like about this is I feel like it's much more honest about saying this is what Batman can do, and there's a whole lot he can't do. And that the reason why the ending of it is so beautiful is that it's Alfred who's kind of saying, like, no, but there is hope, Bruce, that what you're doing can create space for other people to do that. And that the fact that the kids are going back trick-or-treating again is the proof of that in a really great way.
Yeah, exactly. And it does, there is a thing about, I think Batman saying, like, I think Batman can, make a difference or something like that, or still, he says something. And then Alfred's like, I think the same is true of Bruce Wayne. Right. And yeah, you're right. With the trick-or-treaters at the end, it does, it does have that feel of like, oh, maybe there is some hope for the city, basically. Yeah. I think you talked about this at the very beginning in terms of what you liked about it. I think as part of that, it is so important that this is primarily not like the biggest thing Batman does is being a detective. I don't think we ever see the Batmobile or like any kind of super. We don't see much like super gadgets or like Batman doing all like the great toys, as Jack Nicholson Joker calls it. Like mostly what we see Batman do is figuring out mysteries and occasionally winning fights when he needs to win fights. And I really liked that because I think it also kind of highlights that, like, in many ways, the biggest thing that Batman can do is not just win fights with violence and cool toys and show off, but can dig into the things no one else wants to dig into and figure things out. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because most of the story is about mobsters of one type or another, or various criminals, right, getting killed,
and cops and DAs, yeah,
and cops and DAs. No, are DAs killed in this? I mean,
no, but I just mean that it's about Dent and his family as much as it is about
it's
mostly about two families, the Dents and the Falcons.
Yeah, but I was making a very specific point, which is the violence done is basically violence largely against. It is like very specific, targeted violence against the Falcone family and associates. Right? It's not about these big plots to destroy all of Gotham. The Joker tries to, murder half of the people, theoretically, and Batman stops him. But that's like a side note. That's usually Act 3.
Yeah, you're right.
Right?
There is no big plot to stop.
Right. The big plot to stop is usually the main act. Like in the Batman, there's a big plot to stop at the end because that's how you structure blockbusters. And I feel like there's value in that act. I don't feel like it ruins the movie or anything. And I don't think it's a third act. It's like a seventh act or whatever. I haven't really thought a ton about the exact structure of the whole movie. But I do know that's a thing that a lot of people felt like, do we need to do this? And I do actually co-sign the view, like, no, I don't think you needed to do that exactly that way. Right. I do think it's interesting that here, the most public thing Batman does is save all those people from the Joker.
Right.
Right. But that's a side note in this story, which I actually find a lot more elegant and interesting, where it's like Batman's trying to solve this mystery of a bunch of, you know, criminals mostly getting killed. And, you know, spoilers, eventually maybe he does. But he saves like these tons of people from Joker toxin. And like, that's a side note, right? That's just like, oh yeah, this happened. And I think that's kind of cool to frame the story that way.
The big bad's plan is to eventually kill the last of the mobsters, and it works. Like, the big bad does the thing the big bad wants to do. Do
you want to actually get to the spoiler section now?
Yeah, I was thinking let's do that. So let's just take a quick break, and then we're gonna talk about who Holiday is and some other spoiler stuff, and then wrap up. Right back. All right, so we're back. So yeah, let's start talking about the big bad Holiday, and who it gets revealed to be, because we're now in the spoiler sections, going into spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Holiday is Gilda Dent, Harvey's wife, which I definitely did not see coming. What did you think of kind of the way that story wound up playing out?
I thought I liked it a lot. I think early on, you were briefly supposed to entertain the notion that maybe it was like the Joker or something because he just escaped at a certain time, but then you're supposed to, oh, it's not him. And at the end of the first one, you were supposed to think it was Alfonso Falcone, Carmine's son, right? Who actually was Gilda's first husband. And they had met at Oxford, and she was pregnant, and then they got married, and then Carmine found out and had it annulled and forcibly aborted the fetus or whatever it was at that stage. Which, you know, that's not pro-choice, right? Like, non-consensual abortions are bad.
And she uses the words ripped from my womb. And while the word infertility is never stated, there's a running plot line with Harvey and her that she can't have children. And so I think the idea is that they did it in a way that wound up basically like she's unable to get pregnant again or unable to carry a child. Right,
exactly. Like they might have, you know, hysterectomized or whatever. Is that a word? Like, so, you know, this is violence done to her. This isn't, you know, a choice of hers anyway. And
for those, by the way, who decided you don't want to go watch the movie, which is totally fine, though I think it is very good. But for those who are fine being spoiled but are still listening along, we only learn all this at the very end.
Right. Yes. I will say I definitely knew it was her.
That's fair.
I watch a lot of mysteries, and there, you know, there are things I won't talk about, like how the mystery was kind of presented, but I do think they did a lot of things that are an effective way of throwing people off the trail, right? Which when you watch a ton of mysteries, then often kind of become like meta clues. You know? Where like...
I will also say I watched it while very high on some anti-migraine medicine. I was having trouble following some parts of the plot, so it's entirely possible it was a lot more obvious than I thought.
Fair. I wouldn't say that I thought it was obvious. I would say that they did some things that I found to be very clear misdirects. Like they kept talking about Holiday. Oh, him, this guy. And I'm like, they keep saying him like it can't possibly be a woman. And that's exactly the sort of thing you want to do if the killer is actually a woman, right? And then, you know, there's some other things throughout, but I thought it was a good mystery. I didn't think from like, you know, the first scene that it was her. You know, it took a while. I think I solved it before Batman did, but I like that throughout Batman is like, you know, I didn't know the Batman would have to be a detective to do this, basically, right? And then by the end, he becomes a good enough detective to solve it. Right. And no one else does except, Harvey actually solves it. Yeah. Right. And Harvey actually kills Carmine. Right. It's not.
That's right. It's not her who does it.
It's not her who does it.
And then when he gets caught, he takes credit for everything that happened, kind of covering for her.
Exactly. And we don't even know whether Batman tells anyone else at the end. because he's like, I need to know that Holiday is done. And she's like, not done, finished. Like, that was it. You know, she's not like a serial killer who wants to kill a lot of people. She's a person with a vendetta that has been completed, you know?
Right.
And so I think at the end of it, Batman's like, yeah, okay. Like, and I think he sees like his parents were also killed by Falcone, right? Or by their association with him, maybe by Maroni. I'm not sure. Right. And I think it's stated that like nobody knows, right? It's not clear. It's clear that was the reason they got killed, but it's not clear exactly who did it.
Which I have to make a quick interruption. We do see a flashback to his parents' death, and we saw a hand reach for the pearls, and I audibly groaned. But then they just rip them away, and that's all we see of the pearls. And I was like, okay, that's fine. There's no slow motion of pearls. I can deal with that.
Yeah, and we don't even really see them get shot in like full frame. You know, the way it's shot is I think it shows their faces, and then it shows like Bruce's face, and then it cuts back to Batman in Crime Alley, which they don't name,
right? And
some other family who's like, get away from him, and
right. And it's happening while he's on a hallucinogenic drug. So it's much like, I don't want to keep seeing that scene, but I feel like if you're going to show me that scene, they both earned it in the plot and then also like didn't do it as bad as it normally is. That was just my aside. We can go back to the main.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, I was happy in the Batman where they didn't have that scene, right? Here, I felt like, okay, if you're going to do it, that's the way to do it. Cool, moving on, great. And... You know, and because this is an earlier Batman, this is like year 2 Batman, right? There's a comic Batman year 1, and this is like year 2 basically. And so I think Batman like understands, like Bruce understands where Gilda is coming from, you know, in terms of this like wanting vengeance, and he's chosen a different path. But you know, she's essentially gotten vengeance on all the people that he might have wanted vengeance on. Right. So you could say he's got like a little bit of a conflict of interest, really, in terms of like letting her walk, or maybe letting her walk. We don't even know. But it does seem like he's just like, okay, well, you did all these, you know, you caused all this harm to all these people. But if you're done now, okay, you know, what am I going to do? What's the point in bringing you in? And, you know, and like he just stands there while she's destroying the evidence.
Yeah. It reminds me a lot of, you're probably going to know much more about this than I do, and we don't need to go too into the details, but Dexter is another favorite TV show of both of ours, I think. Mm-hmm. The ending notwithstanding.
Yes.
But where one of the points is, like, he is someone who, on the one hand, like he wants to kill in order to, like, you know, have vendettas and to take out bad people. But for him, it also is for him, it is a compulsion. He couldn't just stop. And he comes across as someone who he thinks might be kind of like a partner, both romantically, but also in the same way. But what is revealed eventually is that she had a similar thing. She had a vendetta against a specific group. And once she's finished with that, she no longer needs to kill the way he does. And in some ways, I think that's kind of the question that Batman is trying to get at in that final scene with Gilda of like, are you going to do this again? And you're right. We don't know exactly what happened. We don't know if he turns her in, but I think he doesn't, because I think what's pretty clear is that he is satisfied that she believes she's not going to do this again. And then he doesn't really say anything. He just walks away.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that to me matches kind of what, sort of the lack of the idea of justice being the most important thing, right? The idea being like, the most important thing is what's going to happen next. You know, okay, we know that you did these things, right? We know that you murdered these people. Are you, you know, a murderer in terms of your actions? Well, sure. Yeah. But are you a murderer in terms of your, like, what you want to do with your life? You know, like Dexter is he compulsively wants to kill. Like, it's just a thing. Right. And so, you know, his dad, from Jericho, wants to like find a way for him to channel that in a constructive way that also won't get him in as much trouble, right?
Right.
And here, that's not like who this Gilda is, as far as we can tell. I mean, sure, I would think like if someone deeply wrongs her in the future, she's more likely than a random person to then go through some sort of violent vendetta. But all the people that she really had on her list are dead. She crossed off everyone on her list, and it's like, okay, well, it doesn't seem like you're going to be causing a lot of harm going forward. So, go live the rest of your life.
And I admit, I'm so torn on that because you're right. I think, and this is kind of what we talked about with Dredd not long ago. Criminal justice can have a number of different approaches. And one approach can be, you did a bad thing, and so therefore you should be punished, which I think both you and I are like pretty strongly rejecting because it's just been proven it doesn't work and it feeds into the worst impulses. Another is, we want to prevent you from doing future harm, and so therefore we're going to put you in a place where you're incapable of doing future harm, which I think, can be very helpful, but also there's like a difference between helping to get someone to a point where they're not going to do harm versus just locking them away in a cage somewhere. But I think a third thing is that preventing people in society from doing harm in general does involve letting them know that if they do harm and get caught, then something bad might happen to them. And like, to me here, it kind of goes to the thing you were saying before about how like, I fully want to reform the justice system, but I also don't want to say because right now we have a broken police system, we should do nothing about people who do violence to each other until we have a good system to treat them with. Like we got to do something about it still today and now. So I think that's the one part where I stumble a bit, though I do think that they resolve it well, because I do think that like, I think a world in which we say, if you kill someone, but then by the time you get caught, you can prove you're never going to do it again, you always get to walk free. Like, that's not a good situation. But the problem being that if people think like, oh, someone else killed and got away with it, the fact that Harvey Dent takes responsibility for all those crimes, I think is the one other factor that I think helps Batman be okay with it. Because I do think at least that Batman on some levels, like I said, he's not just going to say, okay, you're never going to kill again, I'm going to let all of you walk free. But the fact that he both understands where she's coming from so much, he sympathizes with that, but also I think that someone else has taken credit. So at least in the public's mind, this crime has been dealt with is a part of what allows him to walk back up those stairs.
Yeah, I agree with that last part for sure. I think in terms of, punishment as a means of dissuading people from doing things, I think that's a whole conversation, but I do think here it is definitely true that he is, given that opportunity to not have someone visibly walking free, right? To have the case be closed as, Two-Face and Harvey took credit. And it's like, okay, well, what's the value in, like, he's going to be in Arkham as long as Arkham can hold him, which, as we all know, is probably not very long. But,
right.
It doesn't really matter whether because he definitely killed Carmine, right? So like,
yeah.
He'll be in there for a while no matter what. And he also, I guess he orchestrated the Arkham prison break as well, himself. So even more evidence that it probably won't hold him that long.
Yeah.
And
to be clear, I'm not saying that like retributive justice helps with prevention. Like that's been proven to be very clear. I'm just saying that also like a system of no consequences whatsoever doesn't seem great either. And that just...
Yeah, I get you.
Yeah.
So I feel like, Batman kind of gets to have it both ways here, right? Where he gets to let this person who has been greatly harmed and then done a large amount of harm as well in vengeance for that, he lets to let her walk and then, maybe have her second life or third life as this. It seems like this middle one's kind of been like a purgatory of sorts for her. Right. And like, who knows what she'll do after that. Right. And there is this theme of like a second life, obviously Batman, from Bruce Wayne, but there's this great scene between Harvey Dent just before he becomes Two-Face and Solomon Grundy, who just keeps saying born on a Monday. And like, but then Harvey goes through the whole cycle of like on Tuesday, something else happened, and Wednesday, and then, you know, he died on Sunday, and then Grundy's like born on a Monday. And he's like, reborn. And then, you know, Dent takes off the bandages and now he's Two-Face. And, you know, this is very clearly kind of his second life. And so, you know, maybe Gilda can have a second life as whatever else, you know.
I did quite like the character of Luca Grundy. Solomon Grundy as the Luca Brasi stand-in for this. And yeah, I thought that was the use of that poem was really well done.
Yeah. I don't know. You had mentioned that. I mean, I think there's definitely some like nods to The Godfather in not to mention like specifically calling Carmine, you know, The Godfather. But I didn't totally get the Luca Brasi, you know, connection. I mean, he didn't sleep with any fishes. I guess he actually does. He lives in the sewer, so I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I think just in like they put him in a suit and they had him as the kind of like almost non-verbal but big effective killer type.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. So just more in terms of vibe rather than kind of plot positioning. I got you. I feel that.
Yeah. So there's one other thing I want to say about the Gilda thing, and then we can just do some kind of last things to wrap up, which is that I think part of why I didn't see it is, like, it works very well for the story, and I think if I hadn't gotten really invested in the other version of what we were seeing of her, I would have liked it a lot more. But one of the things that is done is that, and I think probably some of this is very real, but some of this is to sell her story. Throughout the story until then, Gilda is very much kind of a shut-in, and like she's constantly... Like has obviously like a lot of very down moods, and she doesn't want to go out as much as Harvey does, and like be seen in public as much as Harvey does. And I thought it was one of the most beautiful explorations I'd seen of a character going through long-term depression and reproductive loss of some kind. And the way they showed Harvey, not like hitting her, not like being terrible to her, but still reacting in the way that I think is very common, but is actually quite harmful for a person who doesn't quite understand the mental issues that someone else is going through to respond to with them. You know, and he kind of gaslights her at times. He's kind of like trying to get her to minimize things. And it wasn't shown to be like, look how evil Harvey is to her, so he belongs to everything that's happening to him. But I think it was a way of showing that Harvey is getting so wrapped up in everything else that's going on to him that part of his fall is that he's really neglecting the emotional needs of his wife and of that part of his life. And I still think a lot of that is true and a lot of that still works, but knowing that some of that at least was an act because, like, you know, she would say, like, Harvey, I really need to leave, and then a little while later the holiday would kill someone. It was like sort of like, okay, you gave me one character and then showed me that character was kind of a shadow for the real character. And that's cool, but I really love that first character you gave us. And so it's a little sad that it wasn't taken away, but it definitely was, like, going back and watching it now, I think I'm going to have a lot less sincerity of what Gilda is putting out, you know, and I'm a little bummed about that, even though it still makes her a great twist.
I hear you. I did just watch it for the second time, and I'll say I don't feel like she was putting on an act. You know, like, I do think, you know, when she was at one point, she's like under police protection or whatever. And she's like, I think she's like, oh, I have to go do this. I have to go do this. And they're like, no. But, you know, we can't leave you alone or whatever. And I think, like, I feel like she's both of those people, though. You know, like, I think as Holiday, she's not. Like, there's no personality there, right? She's just going and doing a thing. And I get you that it feels like, you know, you've taken this very specific character and then added this other thing that feels sort of... I mean, it definitely doesn't let the first character just be just that, right?
Right.
And so I feel you there. But
in some ways, I think it's also just the normal representation stuff we talk about of if there hadn't been so few of that first kind of character, I probably wouldn't mind it anywhere near as much.
Right, yeah, where it's like, oh, we finally get, a representation of this who's also a serial killer on holidays. Okay, But
it still was a great twist, and I think that's part of why also I didn't see it coming is because the scene where she's with those cops and wants to get off by herself, I think is probably a lot more suspicious than I gave it credit for at the time.
Yeah. And then also it's just like from a storytelling perspective, it's like, why is this story giving her so much room? Right. I think it's great that it does. And I think it would be great if a story where she wasn't the killer did that. But typically, a comic book story isn't going to focus on, the depressed wife of the third protagonist.
Yeah.
That's an unusual choice. And so to me, that probably popped out as well as an instant, well, who's she?
Yeah.
What is she? Why is she in this story so much? Which isn't, I don't mean it would be a bad choice otherwise. I think it would be a great choice otherwise. It would be very interesting, but it just would be an unusual one. It's I wouldn't expect storytellers to go to those lengths.
And it's funny because I think in some ways you actually made my point even better than I was making it, and also helped me understand how we see the movie a little differently. Because to me, Harvey Dent is 100% the main character of this. I see it primarily about his, and part of that's because I've always been so fascinated with his story, so maybe that's what I glom onto most. But you're right. I thought it was so interesting and so different that they were giving us her story.
Yeah.
And I wish we saw more of that.
Absolutely.
And so that was part of also, I think, the oh, that's why you gave us her story, not just because you think it's interesting. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. And I do feel like they thought it was interesting enough to be actually in another way, she's the main character, right?
Yeah.
It's sure, it's called Batman, The Long Halloween, and a lot of it focuses on, Harvey Dent and him becoming Two-Face, but it's a story about serial killer, right? And she's in some way the villain is always the star, right? And I wouldn't even call her a villain, but she's definitely the serial killer, she's the one, who done it. And so yeah, I think I would love to see something similar that's a mystery that also has characters who you wouldn't expect to be as well fleshed out as she is, who are actually then red herrings, and it's that's all when you do a mystery, you can take any character and make them a big deal, because they are
with a number of members of Falcone's family.
Right, exactly. And they none of them I felt got quite as much, but a lot of them got way more than they would in a story that was just, an action story. This wasn't an action story. It was a mystery that had action in it.
Right. I think you're right. All right. Well, just a couple of last things I wanted to touch on and hear from you as well before we wrap up. I was really impressed with the voice casting. Jensen Ackles, who is most known for Supernatural and now for The Boys, he's the voice of Batman, and I thought he was very good. And it's also interesting because, when people talk about who are the Batman, who are the people who played Batman, I've certainly never heard his name mentioned in the conversation. I think because this is much smaller. Mm-hmm. The only I love having Katie Sackhoff, who people know from Battlestar Galactica and some other things, as Poison Ivy and some other great people,
and as Bo-Katan.
Yeah, very much so. The only thing that I thought actually it was good voice acting, but it just kind of rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. But again, I focus on these things a lot. Naya Rivera, who a lot of people know from Glee, where she really got her start, unfortunately has passed away. She was the voice of Selena Kyle of Catwoman, which I thought was great. Naya is Latina, or Naya. If someone's dead, do you say was or is?
I say was, and
okay.
I say died violently by drowning, not passed away, but that's me.
Naya was Latina and quite dark skinned, and so to have her voice acting a much lighter skinned Selena Kyle, I didn't love, but I also know that we're still going very slowly on that kind of thing, so fair enough. But yeah, other than that, I really loved the voice acting. I thought you're right. The animation was just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah. I mean, the first one, at least the first one, was dedicated to her, as she died sometime between recording the voice and doing the what's it called? And the release of the movie.
The second one, quite tragically too.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, I don't know, it's interesting because it's like that's also kind of the opposite of like if you have, you know, a white actor playing a character with darker skin, like that also is going to be, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that this is probably less problematic than that. And it's possible that they basically had the animation and then they cast her, you know?
Right. That would make some sense.
But I thought she was a very good Catwoman regardless. Mm-hmm. And I did feel that, who was it? I felt like Jensen Ackles was kind of trying to do a Kevin Conroy without trying to do a Kevin Conroy impersonation.
I wondered at first if it was Conroy because it definitely sounded like that strong, gruff, giving very little emotion, but not quite there. Yeah,
and I would say, I don't want someone to do an impersonation, but to me, this kind of hit the sweet spot of like feeling like it was in the spirit of the Kevin Conroy Batman without being like, right, I'm going to try and impersonate Kevin Conroy. Yeah, and overall, I did think the voice acting was excellent, and the but the animation was just I feel like it's on another level from a lot of the other animation that we see from, you know, especially Disney, I guess, particularly in terms of like Star Wars. You know, I mean, there's things in the Star Wars animation that I think are great, like the settings and stuff. But in terms of the characters themselves, like this, it feels more to me like a comic book that moves, you know?
Yeah, I think it's very good. Yeah, it reminded me that way of Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah.
Even though very different styles. Any other last things you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
Yeah, there's one more line from Gilda at the end where she says, in the end, I loved him, talking about Harvey, but not all of him. And I feel like that kind of parallels some of the Bruce and Selena relationship because they're like actually together. They're a couple and Catwoman knows who Batman is, but then they're not a couple, and it's like they clearly can't really make it work, but they kind of try, and then it doesn't work, and then it does, and then, you know, there are two more stories that follow this in the same comics continuity. One is called Catwoman When in Rome, and the other one's Batman Dark Victory, and the latter I think is like a Dick Grayson Robin origin. Okay. Which I think would be really interesting to see, like, handled in the same kind of on the same level as this. And I would really like to see the Catwoman When in Rome, which is she like takes a trip to Rome to try and find out what's up with, you know, her, I guess mostly her mom, because Falcone is dead now here. And it looks like it's like a week. And, you know, whatever. But unfortunately, you'd have to get a different voice actress, mostly unfortunately, because, you know, someone died and that sucks.
Right.
But it would be nice to see like a Catwoman story that's like, this is a Catwoman story, you know, that's not the Halle Berry movie.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it is that same story from the Batman of Falcone was her father.
Right, exactly.
And she says a name at the very end, which I think is supposed to be the point, that that's Selena Kyle's mother's name.
Yeah.
She doesn't even know her mother's name.
Yeah, I think he says Louisa. And when she's at the very end, she's trying to save Sophia, which is, I guess, her half-sister. Or sister, yeah. And she's like, Sophia, and then Sophia like lets go and falls to her death. But it feels almost like they know each other, you know, like she knows her. Which was just an interesting, like, just little thing.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, other couple little things I loved. The Joker at one point makes a comment that why he is so invested in the holiday story is that he, like Batman, loves a good puzzle.
Right.
Which is, I've never really heard it expressed quite that way, but I really like that. Is that something that binds the two of them together? Early on, we talked about how kind of like this is about Batman kind of learning how to do the stuff he does, especially detective work. There's a scene where it's pretty clear, and Gordon actually says this, like he doesn't use the words good cop, bad cop, but he basically was like, I thought we had a thing where we were going to like bluff the violence, and Gordon does the like, yeah, I hope you answer me or else I can't deal with Batman here. And then Batman is like, and he's like, no, dude, it was a bluff. We can't do it.
He's like, I thought we were doing a bit here.
Yeah, it was really good. And I also just like, I haven't actually seen this much since the original Godfather, and I think it's very much a reference. Actually, no, it's in Goodfellas where no, forgive me. This is a bit that I haven't seen since Goodfellas, and then Goodfellas did it in reference to the Godfather, but in both of them, there's a scene where the mobsters are like making a spaghetti sauce that's really great.
Oh, yeah.
And so having Falcone make a reference to how like you have to get the basil just when it's really fresh to like make the good sauce, I was like, oh, I love that. Thank you.
Yeah, it just really made me want to eat some pasta with some like red peppers, like, and you know.
Yeah. Definitely. What we're going to do now, as we're doing for most of the year, is we're going to wrap up. We're going to give the outro, and then there's going to be a bonus section where we talk a little bit more about the episode and other things we recommend, which if you're a Patreon, you get to find out about. And so, Paul, before I go into all that, for folks who are following you, what do you want them to know?
I'm ZenMadman in all the places. Twitch, Twitter, YouTube. I've started coaching, writing, and creating again, and details on all that are available on my website, ZenMadman.com. Like Matthew, I'm also launching a Patreon, and support there will help me spend more of my time making stuff for folks. So if you're heading over to support the Ethical Panda, which you absolutely should do, feel free to stop by mine afterwards.
That's awesome. I'm really glad to hear you getting those things started. And as Paul said, you can find both of us now on Patreon. I'm The Ethical Panda. Paul is ZenMadman. And I know on ZenMadman you get a lot of great stuff right here. If you do sign up to be a patron, pretty much any level, you'll get to have the bonus content that we're about to do. We've been having a lot of fun making those, so really hope you get to check those out. But for everyone who's going to be stopping here, as you know, the best way to find us on all the places is The Ethical Panda. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok. Twitter and TikTok are the main ones I've been focusing on lately, but we do have a Discord, we do have a Facebook page, and depending on content and generation, I'd be happy to make more things there. So let us know what you think. This is not a movie a lot of people have seen, but if you have seen it, we'd love to hear it. If you haven't, what do you think about it? You're now wanting to watch it, or what do you think about all the questions we raised about, this new idea of who Two-Face could be, or how, Two-Face's origin story, or Holiday and who Holiday could be, and the mystery and what Batman decides to do at the end. Would love to hear your feedback and thoughts. The Ethical Panda, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, all those places. And the best way to find all that is going to be in the show notes, or if you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com. There you'll find all the content information. You'll find information about all the other podcasts we're doing. We've been doing episode by episode coverage of The Bad Batch. We have a great episode coming out on The Last of Us with Danielle, written in the Star Wars, who's a huge fan of that show and is going to have she's played through the whole video game. I have not, so we're going to have a great conversation about that. That'll be here on this podcast coming soon. All that's going to be up on the website. So thank you so much for listening. If you're a patron, then we will have more for you in just a second. And for everybody else, have a great day.